You will get the most from any Systems to Win video when you launch it from its video homepage.
All right, now we're getting into the heavy lifting. Steps 2 and 3 of the FMEA process are the most difficult to wrap your mind around, and they are arguably the most important steps within the FMEA process. So back on our online training page for the FMEA process, we're assuming that you've already completed step 1 and you have defined the scope of your project and properly launched your team. And now you're ready to scroll down to step number 2, structure analysis. And this is where you're going to study the interrelationships between the item or the process that is the focus of your FMEA and the parent system or process of which your FMEA is a part, and the component lower level building blocks within your FMEA. So before you just dive in and start filling out your form, now would be a really good time to watch this video if you skipped it earlier to learn what's new with modern FMEAs compared to the older FMEAs that you might have used before. And one of the biggest differences is this step 2, structure analysis, that now provides you much more guidance and clarity for how to analyze those interrelationships between your item or process and its parent and its components. And why is that important? If we go back to the very first row on the help sheet in our Excel template, we are reminded that the entire purpose of an FMEA is to anticipate problems and minimize risks. And a light should go on in your head when you contemplate the truth that every single problem and risk is a direct result from the interrelationships between your item or process and its parent and component relationships. Not some, 100% all of those problems and risks. That's why it's so important to do this heavy lifting in step 2 of structure analysis. The new format provides so much more guidance to overcome the lack of guidance and general sloppiness with which this step was glossed over in the past. So now is the right time to either learn or refresh your memory about the differences between the new version 5 and the old version 4. And to refresh your memory on the difference between how your Systems to Win template differs from any other version 5 FMEA template that's out there. Most importantly, that we preserve left to right workflow, making it much more intuitive to work with. And it's more space effective, and it's for all industries, not just the 0 point something percent of FMEAs that are done for the auto industry. And while you're on that page, scroll up to the top and take a look at the contents for that page, where you'll find quite a few topics to help you make sense of interrelationships between related FMEAs. Remember, all process improvement tools are most effectively used by competent professionals. If some of these concepts are being introduced to you for the very first time, then maybe now's a good time to sharpen your saw and become better at your job. All right, let's get to the meat of step 2, structure analysis. Let's scroll down and see that what we do in step 2 is similar but slightly different based on whether we're doing a design FMEA to design the product or service itself, or a process FMEA focusing on the process that makes or delivers the product or service. And notice that the essential source documents are different for a DFMEA or a PFMEA. And notice that these essential source documents are usually not optional. They co-evolve as your related FMEA evolves, but the first draft of these essential source documents should be completed before you touch the first columns in your FMEA. That was a big missing instruction in prior versions of the FMEA. Now, in addition to the essential source documents, there are also a whole bunch of other source documents that you, as the professional that you are, may or may not decide would be helpful for your particular FMEA. If you do choose to use any of these, then they too should have their first draft completed before you touch the first columns in your FMEA. So let's take a look at those essential source documents. I'm going to say 95% of our viewers are doing a PFMEA, and for PFMEA, process flow diagram is not optional. Let's start with a DFMEA where a boundary diagram is not optional. A boundary diagram is a graphical illustration between your item or service and the stuff that surrounds it. Now we're thinking of designing a new template that has some pretty fancy features, but as of right now, there is no special template to draw your boundary diagram. You just use a regular flow chart template. And what you draw, it looks something like this. It's the thing that you're focused on in that bold line there, and its subcomponents within the line, and all the stuff that surrounds your thing. Those things, those lines that cross that bold line, that's where all of your problems and risks get illustrated. They trigger your human mind to say, what could go wrong with that? That's for a DFMEA. If you're doing a PFMEA, then your essential source document is a process flow diagram. A process flow chart is the most important source document for FMEA steps 2, 3, and 4. And here's a tip: when you are in Excel in your FMEA template, at any time you can click the button to open a blank sheet and then choose the radio button for a process flow diagram, which will insert a new fresh clean blank sheet for a process flow diagram right there in the same workbook with your FMEA. And here's another secret: if you want to see a sample sheet for an inserted sheet, then click the Systems to Win Templates button and scroll down to find the standalone workbook, in this case the process flow diagram, and then open that standalone workbook that will have a sample sheet that has helpful sample data to help you learn how to use whatever sheet you just inserted into your primary workbook. And like every Systems to Win template, you can click any row or column header to get pop-up help, where we learn that the data in this column loosely correlates with the function column on the PFMEA. Or more correctly, you can optionally unhide those columns to the right if you want to get into an unusual amount of detail in your process flow diagram. But it's much more common to keep those optional columns hidden and use this single column on the process flow diagram to summarize both function and requirements in a much less detailed way than you will expand once you get to the FMEA. And this column for sources of variation loosely correlates with failure mode column on your PFMEA. So what do we mean by loosely correlates? We mean that you can use Excel's linking and concatenation features to automatically populate data between your process flow diagram and your FMEA. And if you follow these links, we teach you how to do that. But just because you can doesn't mean it's a good idea. For every one of those essential and optional source documents, the bottom line purpose of doing it is at some point to stimulate a human being to think. And if all that you're going to do is auto-populate from one document to another, you're bypassing thinking. In other words, the phrasing in one document might be completely different from the phrasing in another one. In fact, it might not even be a one-to-one correlation. A one-liner in one document might stimulate 3 related risks and problems in another document. Did we mention that phase 2 is where you do the heavy lifting? Henry Ford has said that thinking is the hardest work a man can do, and that's why so few people do it. Okay, when you're finally done with all of those source documents, you're ready to scroll down. You're ready to finally start completing your FMEA form. And unlike the new AIA GV5 format with your Systems to Win template, you can start at the left and work your way to the right. And this is a good time to remind you that with every Systems to Win template, if you click any header title cell at the top of the page there, you'll get pop-up help, as well as any row or column header. In this case, these gold cells, you'll get pop-up help in the template. But you also have a duplication or expansion of that same pop-up help here in the online training. And that online training can be translated into any language, thereby reducing the risk of miscommunication and misunderstanding among people who are using your tool, the FMEA, whose primary purpose is to reduce risk. And before moving to the template itself, here on the training page, let me point out just a couple more things. One is that from now on in our sample and demonstrations, we're going to assume that you are using a PFMEA because that's what 95% of our users are using. And we're going to assume that you didn't skip this online training that explains the error checking features of your template and this training video that explains and demonstrates error checking, as well as the repeat data features that magically make cells look to the human eye or printer like they are merged cells, but they're not. They still retain the capability of you using Excel's filter and pivot tables. This is the single most powerful feature in your entire Systems to Win FMEA template, and it deserves its own training video. So in this training video, we're going to just demonstrate what we are going to assume you already know how to use. On our FMEA template, let's click the header for this first column and read the pop-up help that tells us that we're looking for the higher level process that these steps are a part of. Now, usually, not always, this might be identical to or very similar to the title up at the top. Now let's keep our sample data very generic. Let's just say that the parent process is to deliver a product or service. And then we copy that top cell. And we don't know the exact number of rows to paste to, so let's just select a bunch. We can always clean it up later. And then we paste. And then let's select the gold header for the next column, where the pop-up help tells us this is where we're going to put the process step number and description, which we will find on our process flow diagram. The first draft of which should have already been completed, but because we're doing a demo, ours is blank. So let's just use the sample data from the sample sheet on that process flow workbook that we opened earlier. So let's just use these 3 processes. There they are. Step number 10.1 drill, 10.2 mill, 20 grind. So we select the row below the top row for the parent, not on the same row with the parent, and we type the step number and description for the first step and the second step and all the steps. And then we copy each and paste the repeat data using what you learned in the video for error checking and repeat data, where we learned that these top rows for both parent and step are intended to be visual section breaks with absolutely no data in any other column in the top row for each section of a parent and each section of a step. So the first function within each step should be entered here, not here, and not here. As explained in the other video, this column does the error checking to make sure that you got your data correct in the first 3 columns. And the pop-up help tells us that the function to the parent level is usually derived from the process flowchart. And remember that on the process flowchart, you could unhide those optional columns to have something closer to a one-to-one correlation with the columns in the FMEA, but usually not. Usually this single column will have a much less detailed version of all of these columns in the function analysis section of the PFMEA. So let's enter some very generic sample data. Starting with an action verb like do, describe what is it that the parent process needs from this step. There may be more than one thing. And again, copy each cell in a top row and paste the repeat data. And when you click the button to fix row heights, everything looks perfect. Let's look at the pop-up help for the next column. Considering both the higher level item and or service being produced and the step, what are the specs needed to provide the function? What are the specs needed to do something? And again, when you simply copy and paste repeat data, all that fancy formatting makes the borders look right while still retaining the hidden data that you need to use Excel's filter and pivot tables. Now this next column for ID allows you to optionally reference numbers in related documents. Many, perhaps most authors will simply hide that column. Now let's look at the pop-up help for this last column in the function analysis section, where it tells us that this is where we should put any requirements from lower level work elements, in other words like sub-steps within a step, and or sub-items within the primary item that we're working on. And notice that the help tells us to first specify what is this child. By specifying that as the very first words within this column, that avoids the need for the third column over in step 2 for child. Let's enter an example. Our very first words are subcomponent A because that is the child. Then we say, what does that child need from this step? Specifying the child right there in the same cell along with its requirements is not only radically more space effective than having 2 separate columns and 2 separate sections, but it's also radically less confusing. Try it the other way and you'll quickly understand what we're talking about. It's really hard to match up those 2 columns that are widely separated from each other. This is a whole lot easier to specify both the component and its requirements in one place. So your next step, if you haven't already done it, is to watch that training video for how to use the advanced features for repeat data and error checking. Because once you get over that learning curve, you will truly appreciate the combination of power and ease of use that you have in this template. You could easily pay your expensive black belts for hundreds of hours to try to reinvent a template that isn't half as powerful as this one, and then pay them even more to try to support it over the years. Congratulations! Once you complete steps 2 and 3 of the FMEA process, the heavy lifting is done. The remaining steps and sections should look very familiar to FMEAs that you have authored in the past. Go get 'em!